Welcome to the Kendo and Aido Italia podcast in this English language version. Enjoy listening.
Welcome to a new episode of the Kendo and Aido Italia podcast. Thank you for joining us again. Today we're diving into something really iconic for the samurai image, the daisho. That's the pairing, of course, of the long and short swords, the uchigatana and the wakizashi. And, this whole practice is really relevant to the history behind modern Budo, especially Ieido styles where, well, sometimes you see one sword, sometimes two.
Exactly. And the big question for us today isn't just that samurai carried these two swords, but why it became such a fixed, mandatory custom, especially in the Edo period. I mean, we're talking 265 years of relative peace.
Right, that's really the heart of our debate, isn't it? Was the legal requirement for samurai to always carry both blades, the longer uchigatana, over 60 centimeters, and the shorter wakizashi, between 30 and 60, was that mainly driven by some kind of retained combat utility, something left over from history, or did it become, overwhelmingly a symbol, a marker of legal and social class distinction enforced by the government?
See, I approach it a bit differently. I'm arguing that the specific functional usefulness of that shorter blade, the wakizashi, which came directly from older combat traditions, that was the fundamental reason it got written into law. The utility was there first. The law just sort of recognized and enforced it.
Okay, I can see that angle. But let me offer my perspective. I believe the legal and social mandate, especially within the context of the peaceful Edo period, was really the number one factor. The requirement to carry the pair, the daisho, was what defined the samurai class legally and visually. You have to remember, the era of constant civil war was over. The shogunate's priority, which you see in laws like the Buke Shohato, was social order, strict class lines. The old context of needing swords constantly for duels or warfare, that had faded. It shifted towards being a required symbol of privilege. And maybe the strongest piece of evidence for this, I think, is what happened when a samurai entered a building, almost any building. He'd take off the long sword, the uchigatana, and hand it over, usually to a servant. So this long sword, the most visually striking part of the daisho, was literally set aside indoors. Doesn't that suggest its main job was public display, a status symbol needed outside in public view? The law mandated the daisho, and that legal definition, it trumped any lingering ideas of constant battlefield readiness in daily life.
That's an interesting point about leaving the long sword behind, but I'd frame its significance differently. Look, while the Edo law absolutely used the daisho to draw that line, visually separating samurai from everyone else, the choice of the daisho itself wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It came directly from functional necessity. You have to look back further, to the times of duels, early cavalry fighting. Samurai used a longer sword, maybe a tachi, for reach, often on horseback. But once they were off the horse or fighting up close, a shorter secondary blade was, essential. And the wakizashi, specifically, was kept through that whole historical change, from tachi pairings to the uchigatana pairing, precisely because it had this irreplaceable usefulness that didn't really care about the political climate. That 30 to 60 centimeter length, that's what makes it better for tight spaces, close combat, drawing while seated, even being a critical backup if the main sword broke or was lost. And unlike the uchigatana, which you pointed out was left at the door,
Yeah.
the wakizashi was always kept on the person. Always, strapped to the hip while eating, sleeping, even in the latrine. This constant carry, even when the main external symbol was put aside, that highlights a practical need that goes beyond just showing off status. The law simply codified this practical reality that already existed. So let me push back on that idea that removing the uchigatana proves it was mostly symbolic. If the Edo law was purely about an external political status symbol, why would the rule allow the most visible part, the uchigatana, to be taken off indoors, yet absolutely insist that the wakizashi stay strapped to the body at all times, even in private moments?
That persistence, that constant carry of the short sword, it demonstrates that its utility, immediate self-defense in close quarters, maybe as a spare weapon, was more important than just fulfilling the external class rules of the Edo period.
The short sword's function was consistent from way back, after the Muromachi era. It was perfect for IIA for drawing quickly from seiza, a kneeling position, something much harder with a longer blade indoors. The law recognized the utility of the short sword, definitely, and then used the pairing as the official marker for the class.
Okay, but I'm not quite convinced by that because it feels like you're separating the pair to make the point about the law's intention. You seem to be equating the obvious usefulness of the short sword with the legal definition of the class itself. I absolutely agree. I acknowledge the wakizashi was clearly useful, retained its function, essential even. But the mandate, the law that strictly defined who was and wasn't samurai in that era, was the requirement to carry the pair, the daisho, not just the handy short sword. Think about it. If utility was the primary driver behind the legal definition, the law could have just said, samurai must carry a short sword for indoor self-defense, or maybe a short sword plus some other identifier, like a badge or something. But no, the law specifically demanded the pairing. The fact that the wakizashi was carried indoors constantly, well, rather than proving its utility, was the main point of the law. It suggests the law strategically used the most functional element of the tradition, that practical short sword, to anchor a symbolic, ritualistic whole. The uchigatana, the one taken off indoors, served that crucial social and legal distinction required by the shogunate's rigid system. The combination was the symbol, even if one part was obviously more practical for daily indoor life. And to strengthen my point about the law kind of taking precedence over pure battlefield tradition, let's just quickly look at the evolution of the swords themselves, specifically that shift from the older tachi to the uchigatana. The tachi, it was generally longer, more curved, meant for horseback, worn with the edge facing down, slower to draw. The uchigatana, though, was designed for fighting on foot, worn edge up, which allowed for that much quicker draw straight into a cut, the very beginning of II. Now, this change clearly reflected how warfare was changing, but the legal mandate for the daisho pairing, that came after the major wars had stopped, during a long period of stability. The timing here is really key, I think. It suggests the shogunate took a recent battlefield tradition, the uchigatana-wakizashi pair, and essentially froze it, institutionalized it as a static class marker, rather than preserving a combat system that was actively needed every day. In peacetime, those technical differences between drawing a tachi versus an uchigatana, well, they lost their immediate operational urgency, didn't they? Yet the legal requirement for that specific uchigatana length remained firm.
That's a fair point about the timing of the law, but look at it this way. Didn't the principle of carrying two swords remain consistent throughout that whole transition? From tachi pairings to uchigatana pairings? That idea of having a main weapon for reach and a secondary one for close quarters or backup? That core principle survived because the functional need for that duality persisted. The sword lengths just adapted to the changing context. Longer, curvier tachi for open fields and cavalry. Then the slightly shorter, straighter uchigatana for fighting on foot in potentially tighter formations. So the Edo law, I'd argue, wasn't just inventing a symbol out of whole cloth. It was preserving this long-standing tactical principle. And the specific lengths it mandated, the uchigatana longer than 60 centimeters for reach, and, yes, authority, and the wakizashi specifically 30 to 60 centimeters for that indoor close quarters utility, those weren't just random numbers picked for status. They were essentially standardized tactical definitions based on prior use. If the law was purely symbolic, couldn't they have just mandated swords of any length? Or maybe even some non-functional ceremonial item? The fact that they stuck with these specific functional dimensions, especially for the wakizashi, suggests that the retained utility provided the logical basis for why the pairing was chosen as the symbol in the first place. The law standardized it, yes, but it standardized something that was deeply rooted in tactical need.
I have to challenge that reliance on the 30-60 centimeter measurement as absolute proof of utility trumping status in the eyes of the law. Yes, that size is tactically useful, we agree on that. But the Edo period was defined by extreme control over movement, over weapons, especially for anyone who wasn't samurai. The law, particularly under the Tokugawa shogunate, was incredibly strict about who could carry any sword and what type. So the law served to clearly mark out the samurai class by forcing them to display this unmistakable sign, the daisho. The uchigatana was the primary, most obvious status marker when seen in public. Now imagine if a non-samurai, maybe a wealthy merchant, carried a sword that happened to be 59 centimeters long. Perfectly practical for indoor defense, perhaps. He'd still be breaking the law, right? Because he'd be displaying a symbol legally restricted only to the samurai. So in that context, the legal consequence and the class restriction tied to carrying that specific object become far more significant than the item's inherent practical value during that time of peace. Utility got subordinated to the legal imperative of class distinction.
I understand the legal weight, absolutely. But I think the very precision of the law actually reinforces the utility argument. Why did the law have to be so precise, specifying two distinct length categories for the daisho? It's because those lengths already had functional meaning within the samurai tradition itself. Think about the situations a samurai might face, indoors maybe, an unexpected confrontation. Being seated, limited space, the possibility of grappling. The short sword was often the only viable tool in those scenarios. If the law's main goal was just class distinction, they could have simply required a visible symbol, any symbol, maybe specific clothing or standardized fittings on a single sword. But the law demanded two distinct, functionally viable weapons. And furthermore, think about the ritual aspect, the potential need for seppuku. The wakizashi, because of its size and the fact it was always carried, was the customary blade for this ultimate duty. Now that's an undeniable, deeply personal utility that has zero to do with public status display, but everything to do with the samurai's code and final obligations. The law essentially recognized that the samurai needed this specific tool potentially for his final act, and mandated he keep it close.
Okay, the seppuku point is significant, and that ritual requirement certainly adds another layer to the wakizashi's necessary role. But doesn't even that point towards the legal and social definition of what it meant to be samurai? I mean, the requirement for seppuku isn't really a battlefield utility in the conventional sense. It's a ritualistic one, a codified expectation placed upon the samurai class in specific circumstances like failure or profound dishonor. It's fundamentally a legal social obligation enforced by the ruling power. So maybe the wakizashi's constant carry in peacetime served two intertwined roles. First, yes, immediate small-scale self-defense. That's low-level practical utility. But second, fulfilling the mandated, deeply symbolic utility tied to the samurai's absolute duty, his code, his relationship to the state. That's a high-level legal requirement. For immediate and ritual utility, it still demonstrates to me that the legal mandate used existing utility, both practical and ritual, to reinforce the overall symbol of the ruling class.
Well, we might just agree that the short sword had undeniable functional value, even if we emphasize different aspects of that function: tactical, ritual, personal defense. My core position remains that this functional necessity, which grew out of centuries of actual combat tradition, provided the structural reason why the daisho pairing was the specific symbol chosen by the Edo shogunate. The law didn't just invent the custom, it formalized and enforced it for political ends. But if that underlying utility hadn't been so strong, so ingrained in the tradition, the law likely would have codified something else, maybe something less practical as the key symbol.
Right. So in summarizing my view, I keep coming back to that dominant historical context, those 265 years of relative peace and the incredibly strict enforcement of class divisions. That environment strongly suggests, to me at least, that the primary function of the two-sword mandate evolved into being a clear, legal definition of the samurai class, a non-negotiable part of the political system. And while we both respect the obvious inherited usefulness of the short sword, the law deliberately elevated the status marker of the pairing above the practical need for everyday battlefield readiness, which had largely passed. The symbol of the daisho became a tool for maintaining control.
And I will reaffirm my stance that the continuous, undeniable, practical, and ritual function of the wakizashi Its necessity for close combat, indoor use, potentially fulfilling the final duty, means that utility and deep historical combat needs formed the very foundation upon which the Edo law was constructed. Utility provided the enduring why, the rationale for choosing the daisho as the symbol, and the reason the short sword, specifically, never left the samurai side.
And, understanding this whole evolution from the tachi on horseback, through the shift to land warfare and the technical changes leading to the uchigatana, and then finally landing on this daisho pairing mandated by Edo law, it really is crucial, I think, for appreciating the history behind modern Budo, especially for understanding things like why we sometimes focus on ai draws from seated positions with a longer blade, and why some aido styles still incorporate forms using the shorter sword.
Absolutely. It really shows us how every part of the samurai tradition, even the elements that got locked in by law, often have these deep functional roots stretching way back into combat history, and that definitely influences how we think about and approach our own training today. See you next time. Happy practicing.
Thank you for listening to this podcast.
Kendo Iaido Italia, il podcast.